Presented exclusively by Mother's Polish.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another edition of the Slipstream Podcast. This is your host, Brady, and we have a full paddock in the Slipstream tonight. My guys, Matthew, and returning from an Alex Albon-style 1 week absence from some vacation, our boys Austin and Cole Trickle Jr. are back. Welcome back, fellas.
Glad to be back.
Yeah, we missed you guys. For this, hopefully you guys didn't have any, appendectomy issues like Alex Albon. A lot more rest and relaxation on your vacation. So welcome back. For this episode, we'll recap the weekend that saw Formula One return to Singapore for the first time since 2019. And did it ever Singapore? With a rain-filled weekend that certainly impacted the Grand Prix and provided plenty to talk about. Before we get into the Grand Prix race review, let's talk a little bit about the gossip and drama surrounding Formula One over the course of the weekend, which included a potential violation of the cost cap by a couple of teams for the 2021 season. So Austin, we'll start with you, and I think we've touched on this a little bit before, but give us a refresher on what the cost cap actually is. When was it introduced and why?
So it was introduced for I think it was 2020 or 2021 season, but it was delayed based on COVID. They kind of did like a dry season, kind of like, hey, we'll check your numbers, but you're not going to be held to it. 2021 is when they first enforced it, but ultimately it prevented the big teams, the winningest teams, Mercedes, Ferrari, Red Bull, from spending $300, $400, $500 million a year, when Williams and Haas were spending 100, 130, 140. So it was something to, limit, with a couple of exclusions, the amount of money a team can spend. Some of those exclusions are engines. I don't know why engines aren't part of that list, but they aren't. Like T&E, super license fees, all but like your top three paid employees. So like your best designer, your, Adrian Newey's, your whoever's. And it's supposed to, in theory, kind of narrow down the field, narrow the gap, and hopefully create better racing.
Yes, over the weekend, there was a lot of gossip and speculation about two teams in the paddock potentially violating the cost cap for the 2021 season as the FAA is auditing all of the submissions. Those two teams were rumored, and again, I guess they are rumors at this point. Aston Martin as a minor violation and Red Bull as a potential minor violation. So again, a lot of speculation here, but Matt, give us a rundown on these violations that were rumored over the weekend.
Yeah, so it came out end of last week, kind of when everybody got to Singapore, that there may be two teams that went over that cost cap. And it's just rumors as of now, and we'll know more on Wednesday. Wednesday is when they certify essentially the cost cap. And if 8 of the teams are certified, which that means that they spent less than what the cap was, then we would know that the rumors were actually true, that Aston and Red Bull were over. We don't know that for a fact. So if your team gets certified, then you're good. If they don't, penalties are headed your way. And then based off of minor or major can depend on the penalty. Under 5% over gets you a minor, and over 5% is a major penalty. Both are rumored, I believe, to be minor. And the rumored fee or whatever it may be, penalty is $7.5 million fine for each team, which is pennies, especially to Red Bull and to a man like Lawrence Stroll. So if it's a $7.5 million fine, you might as well just spend away. Go for it. The cost cap doesn't matter.
Yeah, I think clarify one thing. I think the biggest rumor of the weekend was Red Bull was a major violation, which means they were 5% over the cost cap. So a lot of gossip. I mean, Christian Horner was interviewed multiple times asking about, basically, did you guys exceed the cost cap? So Cole, I don't know if you have any initial reactions, and what would it mean if they did? How would you feel about that?
I don't see. Yeah, it's pennies. I mean, I prefer. Hopefully, it doesn't come out to be that they're both grossly cheating the system. And Red Bull has such a lead. I mean, they have over like 130-point lead in the constructors. Max has a 100-point lead in the drivers' championship. They'll make the money back. Big deal. Slap on the wrist. No big deal.
Yeah, I mean, that's where I'd like to get into it a little bit. I mean, I think you heard some tough talk, of course, from Toto. There were rumors of Mattia Binotto being in the Mercedes paddock multiple times over the weekend. I think Alfa Romeo's team boss came out with some pretty harsh comments. And it seems like, aside from Red Bull, that there's alignment across the board from the other teams that if there were major violations, that the FIA needs to throw the book at these constructors. Because I think the theory or the fear is not only did they potentially have a major violation for 2021, but that the bulk of that money probably went into the development of the 2022 car, which we've seen the results for Red Bull in that case. So I don't know. I mean, we'll obviously get resolution, but yeah, Austin, I know being the Red Bull guy here, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think it's interesting because the team submit these reports back in March, I think. Yep. And they just went, and they probably hired teams of lawyers to go through the stuff to feel like it was in a good place. Then the FIA has to hire teams of forensic accountants to then go through everything. And it's kind of like, it's like doing an expense report for work. Like, you could theoretically say miscellaneous tips, $30, and throw it in there. I think what the other teams are saying is that just because you submit something under budget doesn't mean that based on the paper trail that might follow, that, Pep Boys gave me a $1 front wing. Like, well, and there's checks and balances, in the FIA's wording to say that, like, it needs to be fair value based on market price, and they can kind of see all of the teams and how much they're all spending on things. So, I mean, theoretically, Christian could say, hey, we submit everything under budget. But if they're getting their front wings for $250,000 and other teams are getting them for $400,000, that could add up to force them over budget. I'm not saying that Red Bull might not be under budget. I'm just saying, like, that could have been one of the discrepancies, that they just might be getting a better deal somewhere, but that better deal isn't allowed. I don't know. We haven't seen this yet. So it's all rumor.
Yeah, so that's where my head kind of went. You brought up a couple good points there. In sort of my experience, and I've done some PR in my life, if you watch or listen to Christian Horner's words, they're very crafted, which you want to be, because again, they're allegations. So until anything's proven, you got to give Red Bull the benefit of the doubt. But at the end of the day, he was saying things like, what we submitted should be fine. So Austin, to your point, if they submitted that they got a front wing for $1, then sure, maybe they are under the cost cap. But he never came out and said, we're confident, or maybe he didn't, I missed it. He never came out and flat out said, we were under the cost cap. It was a lot of PR spin, in my opinion, that he has to say, because obviously this is still under investigation. He's talking about these are brand new regulations and we're all figuring it out and what it means and blah, blah, blah. So I kind of feel like Red Bull expects something to happen. Now, Matt, to your point, if it's only a $7.5 million fine and some reduced wind tunnel time, yeah, Cole, maybe a slap on the wrist. But if you read the regulations, the penalties could include point adjustments for the season in which it happened. So I don't think they'll do this, because I don't think the FIA, and again, maybe the violation isn't this severe, but theoretically, the FIA could dock Red Bull and ultimately Max Verstappen championship points. Could you imagine if they docked Max retroactively 10 points for last season and all of a sudden Lewis is an 8-time champion?
It'd be a great Drive to Survive episode.
You could make a Drive to Survive episode off of that, of just a webcam of Christian Horner for like an hour after that gets announced. I'd watch an entire hour of him just snapping things in half and punching holes through a wall if that happened.
I mean, just there's a part of me that wants to see it just because I think there would be absolute chaos, but I also think that's the reason why the FAI won't go that far. Because, you already had a hotly contested championship. There's a lot of drama just on the track. There were some rivalries between Toto and Christian and all that fun stuff. So there was already hostilities that happened. This would take it to a whole nother level.
And you look at the investigation that happened for 8 weeks, 10 weeks after the championship was over, with the, asterisk Massey and what he had done. And they didn't do anything because it's hard to undo something like that. I guess they could, but, to the point about docking him 10 points, what if they dock him 5 points and say, hey, instead of docking him 10, we'll just dock him 5. It's not going to change anything. But now we're setting the precedent that we can and will, but we're not having to rewrite the history books.
And we'll get into it later in the race recap, but there was a penalty going on in the race recap. Sometimes things have to just happen on the track. And it happened on the track, and whether we like it or not, Austin loves it. Some of us don't. Max won a championship. You can't take it away from him 10 months later, or however long it's been since, that happened. I also don't get why it's taken 10 months to go through this, but, that's another standpoint. But it happened on the track. Max is the champion. Move on. Austin, I kind of like your point. Dock them 5, find them some money, set the precedent that it can be done. I mean, $7.5 million is just a luxury tax. I think if you're just finding them money, everybody's going to start going over anyway. So there's got to be some other penalty that could lose you points or places in the standings.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, if you look at the landscape of other sports here in America, I mean, they took Reggie Bush's Heisman from him, a decade after or 7 years after. So, I look, at the end of the day, we'll find out on Wednesday. I absolutely do not expect the FIA to do that. I think that'll be a bigger black eye on the sport than the violation itself. So if you take the lesser of two evils, you're going to take the fine and hope people forget about it. But yeah, I mean, to me, there is the point, though, that if they use that money to make Max's car better to win him a championship, then there kind of is an asterisk on the championship to some degree. Now, we don't know that happened, but that could be potentially why you would go back and retroactively change things because they manipulated the car last year. So we'll get into it. There's more to come, within the next couple of days. Again, I don't think they'll go that direction because you can only imagine what the press room would be like in Japan if that happened. So we'll find out here in a couple of days. We'll get to something else later that's FIA related that, Matt, you kind of alluded to, that I just think the FIA is too scared to make a bold decision at this point. It kind of goes with the easy way out. But first, we'll Matt, go ahead.
No, I was just going to ask, how much money would they have to be over, in your opinion, for them to say, like, we're taking 10 points away? Like, what is your number that is just so extravagant that you just can't allow it to happen?
So
$1.
I think, like if someone goes over $10 million, you fine them $100 million, and then you give $10 million to the rest of every other team, and then they have $10 million less next year. But again, we'll see.
Yeah, Austin, you touched on this, and then Matt, you alluded to it too. I mean, in other sports, there's the luxury tax, right? In theory, there's a salary cap, but you can go, like in the NBA, you can go over it, right? But essentially, that luxury tax is split between the other teams, I think, right? So maybe there's some element, but I don't know. I mean, I understand why there was a lot of attention to this. It kind of violates the spirit of the sport to some degree, but we also don't know for sure what happened. So we can speculate and have our theories all we want, and then we'll know more here. So, but certainly a wild weekend. It felt like every hour or two, Christian was on the defensive in some sort of press room, defending Red Bull, and maybe rightfully so, but we'll find out. So now let's get into the race weekend. And as always, we'll start with your 1-sentence race review. I'm happy to go first to give you guys a second to think of it. But mine, a big Top Gun fan here, so I'm going to go with, I'm going to hit the brakes and he'll fly right by. It seemed like there wasn't a whole lot of overtaking in the Singapore Grand Prix, but there was a few times because of the slick track that people tried to overtake and just kept on sliding right by. It was a little bit like, what was it, Baku last year and Lewis and the brake magic. Hit the brakes and nothing happened, so the one guy let him go through to the runoff area and just let him go right by. So wet conditions throughout, qualifying and the race definitely spiced things up to some degree. There was a lot of people running into walls. Cole, how about your race review?
McLaren. I'm such a fanboy of them. Happy to see that they had a great showing. We will get into it later, but lots to cover. But they didn't hit a wall. They didn't stall out. Double points. Danny Rick looked in good form, and yeah, McLaren all day.
Then what you got?
Hear me out before you call me a homer. I'm going to say thank goodness for Max. The only reason is because I think he had 10 overtakes, even though he only finished one spot ahead of where he started. I think the rest of the field only had 7 on merit on overtaking, like on the track. Singapore is a difficult track to overtake in, especially in those conditions. And there was no action other than cars dropping out like flies. There was really nothing going on.
Mine is it was jam packed. I'm kind of going the opposite of Austin. Like, I get there wasn't many overtakes on the action side point, but something literally seemed to happen every other lap, whether somebody was running into a wall or it was a safety car. This wasn't one of those races where if you were having to record it and watch later that you could just kind of fast forward through a few laps and keep up. Something was happening at all points in time during the race, which at least kept it somewhat, I say a lot exciting.
Yeah, it was interesting. So let's start with qualifying. I know that there was some wet conditions to begin qualifying, and then we got to Q3, and the guys decided to throw on some slick tires. So Austin, sticking on your Red Bull theme here, what happened with Max? He seemed on for 2 laps to have provisional pole wrapped up. He was on a heater, and then he bailed out twice. What happened?
So he was given so much, fuel preparation. Hey, here's how many laps you can do. Here's how much time it is. We expect it to be this many. He went out on his second to last lap. He was ahead on margin for provisional pole. And as they had identified that the track was getting faster, the slicks were getting more beneficial from the enters. You want to be the last person crossing to start the last lap last. And his race engineer said, hey, like, you've got time for one more lap. You're getting really close to Gasly, which will limit the ability that you have to finish the last lap, back off, build space, and then push for your last lap. I don't know if that decision was made without the rest of the team, Hannah and whoever else in strategy, but they forgot the one important thing that disqualified Vettel from his second place finish last year in Hungary: fuel. You have to give 1 liter of fuel to the FIA after you've completed your cooldown lap to get back to the pits. And they didn't think he had it.
Yeah, I was going to ask that because I honestly don't know. Does that rule apply for qualifying as it does in the race? Because Seb's issue was in the race. I didn't realize it was also qualifying, which makes sense.
Yep.
I saw someone asking, like, well, why couldn't he just get back to the pits on battery power? And they basically were like, that's not happening. Or at least it might be 30 miles an hour. But still, to your points, then maybe he would have failed having that gallon of fuel or liter of fuel.
His post-qualifying interview, he did criticize the team, which I appreciated him doing, because I feel like not many drivers go after their team. But he said they expect me to be perfect. I expect them to be perfect. So I do appreciate his criticism of the guys and girls.
I was a big fan of he dropped as many F-bombs as places that he lost by having to do that. So it was a fantastic tirade. I was pumped for that.
Yeah, it's got to be an interesting radio call. I mean, he's on a heater. He looks at his dashboard. He realizes he's up, thinks he's got pole with, this was a race coming into this weekend. He had a chance to lock up the championship. And then on the second to last corner, they're like, box. And he's like, what? And yeah, you heard the radio call. It's not safe for work, but a lot of F-bombs were thrown. He was not happy. So yeah, that qualifying was interesting. I felt like they were waiting for that crossover point. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it wasn't until finally Q3 where they put on slicks. I think Q1 and Q2 were both on intermediates, and the track evolved enough for slicks in Q3.
Yeah, I think didn't Yuki hold provisional pole in Q3 on inters before the soft runners were able to get enough speed to overtake him and put him in wherever he was, 9th, 10th at the end of it?
Yeah, that's right. I think the other surprise too was George being eliminated in Q2. Was he P11? A little bit of a surprise. He seems to usually do well in wet conditions, if you remember Spa last year. So to recap, qualifying, you had Charles with another pole. I think that's at least 9 this year. Checo P2, Lewis P3, Carlos P5, and Carlos P4 and Fernando Alonso P5. So moving into the actual race, the theme of qualifying into the race was there was a monsoon basically, an hour before the race was supposed to start. So there was a little bit of a delay. That's why I kind of made the cheesy dad joke when it rains at Singapore's, because we definitely had some wet conditions. And also, we talked a little bit about this before we started recording. But yeah, there seems to be a little bit of decision-making concern with the FAA. Why didn't they allow these drivers to start on time in the full wets? It seems like they're trying to avoid the full wets for some reason. Any opinions on that?
I do have an opinion about how it was all happening. I don't understand how they can't clear a track. I mean, an hour delay for rain, I understand, but when it stops raining, where are the jet trucks like NASCAR? I mean, I'm not trying to compare NASCAR to F1, but they got those jet dryers out there. I was at least hoping to see a couple guys out there with squeegees firing away trying to clear the track, because it looked like it was just letting Mother Nature do its thing. I couldn't believe we delayed an hour after it was still raining.
If you're delaying a race for an hour, then they shouldn't be going on intermediates and they're talking about slicks at some point. I'm with you, Brady. If you're going to delay it an hour, then there should be a good enough reason to where you probably there's no point for the wet tires if that's just all you're going to do.
Yeah, Matt, that was going to be my point. Like you see it in Monaco, and Monaco had like a power issue on the grid that they delayed the race. But every race that I can recall from this year with the new FIA stewards and making sure that everything is up to regulation, like this isn't NASCAR again, going back to NASCAR. We're not trying to compare it, but NASCAR doesn't have tread on their tires. They don't even have an option for it. Formula One does. They have two options. One that clears some water and some that clear more water than what our cars do on on a normal road. You haven't used those tires. They're available for it. While I get it, it's a safety concern and whatnot and so forth. Like these guys signed up to race, and we've seen a lot of races in a lot of years. What they are racing in way worse conditions. Just use the extremes, or don't have them anymore.
Yeah, I certainly.
Yeah, I mean, I get it in the sense of last year in Spa, like when you can't see because it's raining so hard and the spray is so bad. I mean, that's a different story than what we saw yesterday. It stopped raining. The track wasn't dry, but you just got to get out there at some point. You shouldn't be delaying the race, and then you're on intermediates, and then 30 minutes later you're like, we're almost ready for slicks. It should have just started. I mean, it makes no sense to me. But nothing much that the FIA does makes sense to me at this point. So
the inters displace 30 liters of water at 300 kph, and the full wets do 60 liters at the same speed. So you can't. I mean, it makes zero sense why they waited as long as they did. And honestly, most of them probably should have started on full wets from the get-go. I think Lewis was upset that the team chose the wrong tire for him for the start.
I think he still wanted inters. He just wanted worn inters that had a little bit less traction because he needed more temperature. I think that was his point.
Yeah, Austin, I think you're right. There were some questions of whether he wanted wets or intermediates, but I think they confirmed that he wanted a scrub set, likely for that reason. Yeah, I mean, I agree. There was a lot of stuff going around social media that basically was like, why even have wet tires if you're not going to use them? Like, that's literally the point. And they decided to just delay it an hour, which I don't know if that caused the time shortened race. I mean, they still made it 58 of the 61 laps. It wasn't that much shorter. Still, I find a timed race to be a little underwhelming. It's a little weird to see the countdown timer.
I think they start the timer as soon as they open pit lane. I'm not 100% sure about that, but I think as soon as pit lane opens, their 3-hour clock starts.
Okay. So yeah, I think that's cool. That's a good point. I think you obviously have a number of laps that you have to run in a Formula One race, or at least what it's scheduled for. But for whatever reason, if there's red flags or weather or what have you, and there's any other delays, there is a time limit to a race in which it has to be completed within that time limit. So into the race, again, Charles had another pole. I think I said that was his 9th of this year, but Checo had a great start and took the lead into turn 1 and never gave it up. So kudos to Checo. Checo was your winner, and we'll get into a little bit more about that. But throughout the race, there was a lot of slip and sliding going on. There's a lot of DNFs. Matt, got to briefly talk about your boy Latifi again. Basically slamming Joe, and I felt so bad for Joe. I mean, he was making his first ever start, I believe, in Singapore, just minding his own business, and Latifi just jams him into the wall, and they're both DNF'd, causing a safety car.
I think he said he didn't see him. I don't know how. He's literally right next door to you, and he just slammed straight into him. He's gone this season. This is a reason why.
Yeah, and I may get his last name wrong, but Fred Vassauer, who's Alfa Romeo's team boss, he said DNF has nothing to do with luck or bad luck. Sometimes it's a technical issue, sometimes an engine issue, and sometimes it's Latifi.
Now, I will go back to a point that I made in one of our last pods, is that I'm excited Joe got the seat next year. He continues to DNF for reasons that aren't his own. And I just hope that we can see what because when he races well when he's not out of the race. So I hope next year we get some competency surrounding him just to see what he can do.
Yeah, there was another hilarious video, I believe it was during qualifying, where it's kind of an angle looking behind. I want to say it was Max or Checo, who's doing a hot lap in qualifying, and then all of a sudden you see Latifi's car back up in front of the camera because he went in the runoff and made another mistake. It's like, and there's Latifi going backwards. So, yeah, another poor race for Latifi. He actually, this is also kind of ironic, he's receiving a grid penalty for next week, a 5 grid penalty for the incident with Joe. I don't know if it's an accumulation of penalties or just specifically for that one. But yeah, there's also a lot of fun memes going around where how do you get a 5 grid penalty if you're already in 20th? You can't start 25th. So like, if you're 20th and you're getting 5 grid penalties, you're still 20th. So a penalty, but no penalty for Latifi next week. And unfortunately, it ruined Joe's race and caused a safety car at lap 8. Matt, when we chatted a little bit of race preview, I put the over under at half a lap. So I was a little wrong on first safety car. It came out at lap 8. Yeah, so Cole, want your thoughts here. Yours, a little bit of our resident historian along with Austin. Alonso coming into this race was in his 350th Grand Prix and unfortunately ended in a DNF.
I hate it for Fernando. He mentioned in his interview that to no fault of his own, he's out about 60 points. So if you look at all of his DNFs and you add up his potential 60 points, it obviously puts Alpine clearly ahead of McLaren in the constructors. It puts Fernando, I think, ahead of Lando and the drivers. So I was really disappointed because obviously I love to see Fernando get his elbows out, but just more and more disappointment for Alpine.
On the flip side, Fernando, on his own merit, is costing himself an extra 75 points by going to Aston Martin next year. So we can blame him next season when he's at 32 points.
Hold on, do you guys hear that? The money truck backing up. I think Alonso will be all right. Yeah, unfortunately, and I know Cole, you'll get into this, but there ended up being a double DNF for Alpine this weekend. Ocon also had an issue where caused him to DNF and brought out another virtual safety car, so led to no points for Alpine this weekend. And how'd your boys in the orange do this weekend?
Double points. I don't remember their exact standings. 6, 7, 5, 6, somewhere in there. Outstanding for Danny Rick. I mentioned it before. He put on a heck of a show. I'm so excited that it wasn't even a great race for him. I just think with all the mishaps that everybody else had, they're just stay clean and you'll score points at that point.
I think he was one of the last people to pit. So everyone else had done a normal pit cycle on the normal 27, 28 second window. Max pit the lap before. He was told to go opposite Norris. The safety car came out in that time frame. Norris and Ricciardo both got free pit stops, and yeah, I mean, Danny came out in 6th, and with Max's kind of shunt, he ended up getting 5th.
Yeah, so good weekend for McLaren. I know they had their special livery this weekend. I think it was in partnership with something to do with Halo, maybe. But it looked cool on the track underneath the lights. Kudos to Danny Rick. I know we've talked about him a lot lately in terms of his desire to stay in the sport with not being with McLaren next year and what ultimately is going to happen there. Cole, I know you may have some rumors about him maybe being a reserve driver for Mercedes. But yeah, he went from 16th to 6th or 5th. So phenomenal performance for Danny Rick.
It will be interesting. There, he was seen leaving the Mercedes hauler. Just a few more speculation of him potentially being a reserve driver for next year. Doesn't have a confirmed seat yet. Has said he's open to reserve. Why wouldn't you go to Mercedes? But back to it. Great drive for Danny Rick. Happy McLaren is back on, at least in racing form against Alpine. But yeah, very excited to see what Danny decides to do with his future because obviously it's not with McLaren.
What other reason would a driver be in another team's hauler? Like, are they just in and out of all these at all times? That seems odd, but correct.
Doing some TikTok videos or something?
That could be it.
He does, I've seen him pop into the AlphaTauri just to yell Pierre Gasly. So he does make appearances. But just adding, if he said he's open to a reserve driver, a reserve seat, there's no other seat on the grid that would be a potential for him. So, yeah, Mercedes could be a great move for him. Honestly, keep him relevant.
Yeah, I know we've talked a lot about Danny Rick. I'm happy for him. It's great to see him perform well. Tricky conditions too. I mean, the race, if you're just breaking it down in a nutshell, at least in my opinion, you'd have like 8 or 10 laps and someone slide into the wall or a DNF. A lot of stop and starts, a lot of virtual safety cars, a couple of, I think there was at least 3 actual safety cars. I think, one of the most impactful, aside from the Latifi issue early on, was the Yuki crash. I think I said it in our text thread. For those that follow us, we do a Twitch stream, weekly where we, race on the tracks against each other for some fun. And I'll take all the blame here. There's someone here, it's me, that causes intentional safety cars from time to time. I'll admit it. To me, when I watched Yuki crash, I don't think he hit the brakes. He was flying. Those brakes locked up and he went straight into the wall, which Lewis did the same thing, I think, in the exact same corner, but managed to really, he did a little damage to his front wing, but didn't break a wheel or break an axle, was able to continue. But that brought out sort of the last safety car. But yeah, for me, I just got a chuckle because I was like, yep, that's exactly like something I would do in my own race. And sure enough, caused another safety car. But it felt like every 8 or 10 laps, someone was sliding off course or DNFing and causing some issues on the track. Yeah, I mean, we can talk a little bit about Lewis here. I mean, he Qualified P3, I want to say he was 54,000th off of pole, so nearly had a pole, and maybe in dry conditions, maybe would have gotten pole or could have gotten pole, which is good to see him close to the front. I will say a lot of mistakes for Lewis this weekend, not only from the nose piercing, but to a couple issues with sliding into the wall or trying to take an overtake. Not his best performance this weekend.
Yeah, it was. I like Lewis. I think the nose ring thing is just moronic. Again, FIA. If we want to go on an FIA rant, that's a different story. He irritated me for whatever reason on Sunday. Multiple times he complained on the radio about how slow I believe it was Sainz was in front of him, and then another driver. And I get it. Austin already put up the overtake stats, and it's hard to overtake, and in those conditions. But it's like at some point, if you can't complain about him being slower if you're not. He didn't attempt. There was no chance, and then the one time he did, he floors it into the wall. Like I don't know how his wing didn't break even more than it did. And then like he pits, and then the next lap, and I'm not sure what safety car that was. There was like 14 of them, but and then he goes on his radio and he's like, tough break. We just pit before that, and it's like, no, don't run into the wall. Like it's not a tough break. You ran into the wall. Like you could have pit just in if you wanted to, but you decided to power slide it head first. Like he didn't make any sense to me with some of this stuff he was saying this week. It kind of, I like Lewis. I won't say I'm a fanboy of Lewis, but it was kind of infuriating his methodology or his thoughts on what was going on. I still don't get, tough break. No, I mean, don't floor it into the barriers. You'd be good if you didn't.
Well, I don't know if this is the actual reason or someone was making a joke, but I think it might be serious. Or seriously a joke. The reason why Lewis had his nose piercing is because it was infected, Matt. So the guy's got an infection in his nose ring, and the best way for it to heal is the nose ring has to stay in there. So guy was dealing with a lot this weekend.
Well, sometimes, hey, infections can get to the brain, and that may have been what happened.
I remember that one time in college when your belly button piercing got infected, but we'll save that for a different podcast.
Lewis also looked like of all the accidents that we saw, it looked like he had the hardest shunt. It looks like he hit the hardest but had the least damage of everybody. I was blown away how hard he hit and how little damage he actually had.
Austin DNF rant on deck. Let's go.
Like I don't have the telemetry. I wish I could find it. It's not worth it. It's not going to convince me anymore. Yuki hit at 5 degrees and Lewis hit head on. And it was the difference of completely snapping your suspension. Lewis had to have hit that wall 40 miles an hour. And he bent an end plate.
Yuki seemed like 100 miles an hour.
Yuki's was... If you watch the onboard of when Lewis hit the wall, Lewis hit the wall, whatever. Like, I rewatched the onboard. It is hard.
I mean, you see all the water from the barrels come pummeling out. I mean, his car was soaked from the water hitting it. I mean, he crushed the wall. I was shocked. I was like, oh, Lewis is out. He's done. Oh, he's back. He's good. How's that possible?
That's just the difference between a 7-time champion and a second-year driver. He can narrow that down by 5 degrees to make sure he hits the wall. So all he does is have the left side of his wing just dragging the ground. Just epic talent right there from that move.
Look, I think it was a 200 IQ move. It was about the time of the race where people were flirting, and maybe even at this point, George was already on mediums and on slicks. The guy just needed to cool his tires. So he was looking for some extra water on the track and found it found it next to the barrier.
It was a great shot, Jordan. I mean, like the slow-mo of when he hit and then just the water just like cascading off of the top and just like splashing off of his car. It was really good camera work.
So real quick on the DNFs, we've kind of mentioned them all at this point, but interesting stat, Matt. I know you're always good for a little nugget. Your three Asian, the continent drivers, didn't finish. Zhou, Albon, Sonoda.
Hopefully, they have a better showing in Japan.
Yeah.
I think only one of them. Well, at least one of them, it wasn't their fault. Going back to Joe, he got sabotaged by Latifi. Yeah, that's interesting. One other stat, just to put a bow on it for you, Cole, is that McLaren is now P4 in the constructors. They're 4 points ahead of Alpine. So, that's the closest race in terms of constructor standings, other than sort of P7. You've got Aston Martin now ahead of Haas and AlphaTauri, but they're all three only separated by 3 points.
Haas, the only team that had 2 drivers finish and get 0 points. So great day for them. At least they didn't have any extra cost cap hits for him.
And K-Mag had a good
leads me-
qualifying. He qualified well, I believe.
Yeah, he did. I'm pretty sure he was in the top 10. Yeah, but Matt, that leads me to another sort of. I thought it was funny where, George, we mentioned he was eliminated in Q2. He qualified P11, but then he started in pit lane because he took some internal engine parts. So obviously he was trying to navigate throughout the field and had some issues where he had bumped someone, got a puncture, tried to go on mediums, had his own issues, right? So he's in the back of the field. He's sort of reliving his Williams days. And he's trying to make a pass on Mick Schumacher, and he clearly goes into Mick Schumacher, which I think caused the puncture for both of them, I think. And he was like, I gave him plenty of room. And then Martin Brundle's like, no, you didn't. You turned right into him. And then something like, there was one other comment when he was, maybe before that, when he was trying to overtake him. He was talking about how Mick Schumacher was trying to defend him like a lion or something like that, or like his life depends on it. Like, look, if you're Mick Schumacher, sure, you may be in P13 or whatever, but you're also fighting for your job. I mean, what was George doing last 3 years when he was at Williams? He would have done the exact same thing. So I love George, huge George fanboy. Not his best race, and certainly not the best look, complaining about the drivers in the back who are doing their best with what they have. He should know that better than anybody.
A lot of grow up George talk on social media after the race on Sunday. He's always pointing the finger. He rarely takes the blame on his mistakes.
It's interesting too that he said in an interview that he had the car to win. Okay, sure. Like Lewis qualified third, he would have qualified fourth if Max didn't not cross the finish line twice. George, you qualified 11th. You started in the back and you finished in the back. So like you didn't give yourself an opportunity to even be on the lead lap.
How many laps was he even in the points? A handful of laps? I mean, he was barely
he
ever
wasn't.
in the top. Yeah.
Never. Yeah, I don't think at all.
He I think he and Bottas got a little dicey. He sent it on Bottas. He had to turn around, and the runoff, I think that's when he decided to then he pit, whichever, got a flat, pit again. Like, it just, I don't think he ever got above like 16th when everyone was running. And then I don't think he ever got above 12th once there were 5 DNFs.
Yeah, I mean, just a brief recap of the overall race. There were 14 drivers that finished. So there were 6 DNFs, and Russell got 14, 2 laps down. So, yeah, not his best weekend. I'm sure a weekend he'd like to forget, as would a few other drivers. And Matt, yeah, to your point, the Haas drivers finished 12th and 13th. So they were the only team that had 2 finishers and no points, unfortunately, for them. And Cole, your boy Seb, final race in Singapore, where he has, I think, the most races in the history of that race with 5 wins, P8. So good for him.
It's always nice to see Seb do good things. It doesn't happen that often in that Aston Martin, so hopefully we get a few more good outings for Seb before it's all over for him.
Agreed. And at least there's a short turnaround to Japan, which we'll talk about here in a second. There's two other quick things I want to talk about with the race. One other thing that I find interesting is I read this somewhere earlier. So Charles Leclerc has had 9 poles this season, and he doesn't win the races. Like, I think he's got the 9th worst, pole to win conversion rate in the history of Formula One. Now, a lot of those have happened this year. So, just curious, why can't he pull? I mean, Austin or Matt, I know you guys are sort of the data crunchers from time to time. There's a lot of races where the pole sitter has won 9 races in a row at a certain track. So a lot of times when you are the pole sitter, your odds to win the race are substantially higher for obvious reasons. But obviously in Formula One, it's even more important because there's racetracks like Singapore where it's very difficult to overtake. But Leclerc's having real issues converting that pole into wins, especially this season. Would you be worried about that?
Yep. Like he's qualified on pole on the 2, 3. Was he in Baku as well? Like on all of the street tracks. Surprisingly, Red Bull swept the road or the street circuits this year. First time that's ever happened. No constructors ever won all of the street circuits in one year. Leclerc, again, it's a great car. He is able to put it on a knife's edge and put it right where he needs to, just at that limit, and sometimes a little bit over, and we've seen that. But is it mostly him? Is it half him? Ferrari's made a lot of bad strategy calls on that. So I think that there's an asterisk, right? Like there's an asterisk with that 22.22% pole to win ratio, 9th worst ever. It probably would be a little bit better if he wasn't on Ferrari, but still, he's got to finish.
I would be a little. I mean, I'm concerned about Charles, but he's in a Ferrari. Carlos, he looked real slow. He had no pace. I'd be keeping an eye on Carlos to see how he continues to perform. He said in an interview as well that he didn't think that people were excited if he would get a win, that people really wanted Charles to win. So he seems a little down on the team, rightfully so. But while Charles can't seem to close it out, Carlos just looks off the pace from Charles completely.
I believe Sainz even said in the post-race interview he was pretty tentative given the conditions, so likely wasn't taken. I mean, now I guess the only positive you can take away is he finished P3 and he didn't spin, so at least it worked. And in a track where there's a little overtaking, maybe that's all you needed to do.
But if you don't have those safety cars, I don't know the numbers, but you have 3 safety cars to reset the field, on 8, on, a handful of them. Charles and Sergio likely, if without safety cars, would have lapped Carlos. He was 25, 15, 25 seconds behind on nearly every safety car before the next one. So, he finished 3rd. He didn't make any mistakes. But if you look at the caliber of him compared to Charles in a track that's a little bit more harder to navigate, light years behind.
Agreed. I think let's talk about Checo for a few minutes. He obviously was the race winner, had an incredible race. I think, Cole, to your point, when you compare teammates like Max versus Checo, there's plenty of weekends when Max is clearly the best driver. I mean, he's the best driver in Formula One, period. But that gap between teammates seems to be pretty significant from time to time. You wouldn't have known it this weekend. Checo took the lead in turn 1 and crushed it. I mean, Leclerc's got a lot of pace, and Leclerc could never catch him. So that was exciting to see. I know there's a lot of people, especially Christian, and I think even Checo himself, said this was his best race ever. And I think that's his 3rd win. We had Sakir Bahrain a couple years ago, his 4th win, where he went from last to 1st, and then he's got a couple this year. I don't remember the exact stat here. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but very few times in the same season has somebody won Monaco and Singapore. I think Seb was the last one to do it, maybe in 2000. It's a pretty cool stat.
It was extremely impressive. I've kind of been not a Checo hater, but I've just kind of been open that I haven't thought he's raced up to par this season, and it was incredible to see what he did after that last restart. How he just pulled completely away from Leclerc, and Austin may have some data on that. But I will say, I know they said it may have very well been his best race of his career with how he did. Sakir had to be more important, though, right?
Well, I think if you look at his 4 wins, you've got the win in Sakir, where he was last, came up to first. Look at what happened to that field. Max and Charles took each other out on the first lap. Lewis didn't start because of COVID. George was going to win the race, had, a blowout, had to pit, wrong tires, pit again. Bottas didn't perform. A lot of things happened there. If you look at his win in Baku last year, Max was miles ahead, tire failure, ends up holding on when Lewis brake magics past him. Monaco, Ferrari had the really bad strategy, having both of the drivers pit, give him the lead. This is the first time, I think that's why they're saying this is his best race ever, where he, on his merit, got first place, kept it, and then when they said in the closing stages, you might have a 5-second penalty, you're 2.8 seconds ahead, there's 10 minutes left. You need to build a gap. He built a 7.9 second rough, whatever it is, gap. Super impressive.
Yeah, that was ridiculous.
And we talked about it a few podcasts ago. Checo's only 2 points down from Charles in the standings at this point. So we kind of thought that Checo would at some point jump Charles. That's coming. Checo had a few bad races, but it seems like he's definitely closing the gap, and he will absolutely finish second in the championship this season.
Yeah, a ton of credit to Checo. It was awesome to see. I mean, it almost looked like he was Max out in front this weekend. I mean, he wasn't going to let this race get away from him. To touch on this sort of potential penalty a little bit, I do find it interesting, and this might get us into a little bit of an FIA conversation. The supposed penalty, and my biggest bone to pick here is that I think there was 41 minutes left in the race, or roughly 40 minutes left in the race when that last safety car came out. And so there was an issue where potentially Checo fell too far back. Maybe he did it multiple times. You're supposed to be within 10 car lengths, I believe, of the safety car until the lights go out. So there's multiple potential infractions. And so basically what ended up happening is they came over the broadcast and said that they were going to investigate it after the race. Which to me, you've got 40 minutes to figure out. And I get they probably wanted to talk to him to get his opinion. But, you still have this potential issue where, like we talked about earlier with the whole cost cap issue, where the FIA at least might have an opportunity. Opportunity is not the right word. They might take the win away, take a championship away. And so it kind of makes the finish feel a little weird, at least in my opinion, where, Checo certainly on the track deserved it, but then this thing was hanging over his head for 5 hours. Until they finally confirmed that he only received a 5-second penalty. And Matt, I don't know if you were alluding to this earlier. I don't know how you get one 5-second penalty for multiple infractions. My opinion is that's the FIA's compromise to A, penalize him, and then B, not cause controversy. Which that isn't their job, in my opinion.
I don't understand. I don't know why Checo's opinion even matters. First off, I don't know why they need to talk to him. They've got I would assume every view that we do as fans, if not maybe even more, to be able to judge, is he too far back? Can you judge that from the cameras, whatever it may be? And then if it is multiple infractions, unless it is a build-up, in the sense like corner cutting where you're warned once, you're warned twice, and then a penalty. If that's not the case, then I don't know, and I don't know why it's a 5-second penalty for multiple infractions. It does seem, again, they're trying to not change the outcome of the race with the penalty decision when they just could have made that penalty decision 10 minutes after it happened, and then the race is still won on the track, no matter what their decision may be.
But what if it was the cumulative? We just didn't see the process. So you can exceed track limits 3 times, and the next time you get the black and white flag, like, hey, if you do it again, we're going to dock you for time. What if they just said, hey, you did it 3 or 4 times, or whatever. You did it 3, we overlooked it. You did it the 4th time, we're going to warn you. You did it the 5th time, we gave you the penalty. So like that might have been how it was solved.
It very well could have been. It just seems, again, the FIA seems to have the most ambiguous rule book out of any sports rule book out there. I mean, I don't know what cricket is or water polo is. I don't know their rule books, but this just seems, it's just always up for interpretation at any point in time, except when you're in Austria on corner cutting.
Yeah, I mean, Austria got a lot of grief for how strict they were with corner cutting, but I feel like for the most part, the regulations need to be that black and white. It's like, if you exceed 10 car lengths, then it's a penalty. It shouldn't be like, if you exceed car lengths, let's talk about it after the race. Because then there's influence, right? Whether it's good, bad, or indifferent, you're influenced by Christian or Toto or the driver themselves. Like, make it a rule, and if they violate it, then it's a penalty, or it's not a penalty. Like, it really seems like it should be that easy, and that's why my biggest issue was took 40 minutes plus 4 hours, and we still didn't finally get resolution until they came out and said Checo only received a 5-second penalty and still won the race. To me, that was the FIA being like, all right, we're going to give him something, but we're not going to affect the outcome of the race because that's going to cause a whole nother issue. When maybe, and again, I haven't read the regulations, so I don't know this, but maybe they should have penalized him 10 seconds. But I understand the sort of downstream effect that could have from a PR perspective, or like, I can't believe you just took the race from this guy. Like, people will be mad about that too. So they're sort of in a lose-lose situation, but that's also their job. So one, I'd like to see them resolve them faster. And two, I'd like to see the rules a lot more black and white. It either is or isn't a penalty, and the decisions are made much quicker.
Well, I don't know if they've had over 1,000 races in Formula One history. So like, there is a pretty good foundation on this, but like, the NFL has 500 games a year, more than 500 games a year. So like, the rules are being created, and the technical regulations and all of these things are being crafted as they start identifying that there's a lapse or a gap in what they're currently officiating or regulating. And they're revised and added on and amended all the time. I think, as we noticed last year with the issue about the race director and Massey having the final say, they've completely changed it, and it's different. It may be better, maybe worse. I like that the white line is the white line. If you go outside of it, you're off the track. Like, that makes sense. But I don't think a lot of these situations have never been brought up before, and like, they don't just brainstorm, hey, like, this might be a little gap that we don't have currently identified, and now that it's identified, it'll probably be revised in future regulations.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think we could probably have a whole podcast on the FIA. I mean, I think one of our Instagram followers, provided a comment that he just feels like Formula One feels different since Abu Dhabi. And, don't exactly, I think his name's Yobanks, Yohbenks. I don't know exactly what he means by that. I mean, my interpretation of that is they're so scared to have controversy because Abu Dhabi was so controversial that for right now, they're going to make the decision that's the least controversial. So that the Checo 5-second penalty still could be controversial. It's just not as controversial as stripping him from the win. And that's sort of the choice that they're going to make because of Abu Dhabi. Instead of, in my opinion, making the correct choice, regardless of the controversy. Same thing with the cost cap. If Red Bull or Aston Martin grossly violated it and the penalty is 10 championship points, they should do it. I mean, that should be the letter of the law. There should be little interpretation, but they won't because they don't want the controversy. At least that's my my soapbox on that. Don't know if that's right. Don't know if that's wrong, but that's sort of my general opinion. But regardless of that, Checo gets the win. Great race for Checo. I'm not taking anything away from him. More of an issue with the FIA more than anything. A couple other just sort of comments, stats related to the ultimate outcome is, I think we mentioned this earlier, but Max obviously did not win the championship in Singapore. He has another opportunity to do so in Japan. I believe if he wins the race and gets fastest lap, he will be your 2022 champion. Another fun fact that I know, Cole, you'll appreciate. I know you had a take that Seb would win every race for the rest of the season. He did not do that. So Vettel's streak of 9 consecutive wins will stay. Sure you're happy about that?
I'm very okay with that. I mean, I think Max will beat it. He will beat it. But obviously can't control it all, and Seb stands another day.
Yeah, I was a little surprised. I mean, I think conditions with weather always makes things spicy. I know Matt and I, we talked about that in our preview a little bit. I would say it's good and bad to have a little bit of rain this weekend. I don't know if I want rain on the street circuit. It's already hard enough to overtake, and I think it made it even harder to overtake in Singapore. But the good news is Vettel's streak stays. At least good news for him. Max may have another chance to beat it and has a chance to win the championship this week. So just brief look ahead. We've got a quick turnaround to Suzuka in Japan, right? So another opportunity for Max to win the championship, another opportunity for us to watch our boys on the track in a couple of days. I also think it's the first time did they go to Japan last year?
No, it's been a few years since they've been, and it's such a great track. I know all the fans are super excited to go back to Suzuka. I think it's been maybe 2 years. It's been a little bit since they've been there. So it'll be Yuki's first home race. It's probably going to rain, but we'll see what happens.
Yeah, so last thing for you, Cole. I know that I think it's being confirmed that Nick DeVries will be in AlphaTauri and Gasly will be at Alpine. I don't know if it's official, but even Gasly commented in the press room that his future will be resolved within the next couple of weeks. So it sounds like that's the direction it's ultimately going to go, which I know you've been all over for quite some time.
Pierre also threw a little shade at the team, that their cars can't catch on fire and that, they need to finish races. So it's the first time he's really been a little more outspoken about the team, which again leads us all to believe we've been talking about it for before the podcast even started, that he will eventually be in that Alpine seat. So happy for Nick DeVries to get a ride if it's confirmed for AlphaTauri, and huge for Pierre to get a performance jump and a reliability. Well, not reliability after Singapore for Alpine, but a performance jump moving ship.
Yeah, I'm going to have to get a new shirt behind me for my boy Pierre moving to Alpine. And I'll be in the Alpine in our Formula One 2022 season, it sounds like. So we'll race Suzuka here in a couple of weeks, which is always a tough track. But we're looking forward to the Formula One drivers getting back on the track for the Japanese Grand Prix this weekend. So that'll wrap it up for this episode. As always, we appreciate you tuning in to the Slipstream podcast. Check us out on social media at Slipstream F1 Pod. We'll catch you next time.